In today's episode, we're looking at 4 people whose deaths happened where they least expected, inside their own homes. From a woman in Russia whose beloved pet chimpanzee turned without warning, to a South African teen whose friendly visit ended when a tiger burst through a faulty enclosure gate. But first, we begin in Louisiana, where a weekend visit between friends turned deadly the moment one man gave in to fear and the snake in the room tightened its grip. July 13, 2013 was the kind of day where everything felt sticky and slow in West Monroe, Louisiana. The heat settled low over the town like a lid and the air buzzed with cicadas. Down a gravel road on the edge of town, a ranch house sat behind a gate tangled in kudzu. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years, but inside it was alive, with something quieter, colder, and far more dangerous. Carl Wessner lived there alone. He was 48, unemployed by all appearances, and rarely left the property. He'd been obsessed with reptiles since childhood, and now, without a family or steady job to distract him, he'd built his entire life around them. The walls of his home were lined with glass tanks, stacked high, looped with cords, lit by buzzing heat lamps. Inside were snakes, ball pythons, boa constrictors, milk snakes, even a few venomous species housed in poorly labeled enclosures. Carl didn't care. He kept meticulous handwritten notes on feeding, humidity, and breeding cycles. His forum posts were long and opinionated, often criticizing new keepers for being too cautious. He saw himself as an expert. Some might have called him reclusive, others obsessive. But to Carl it was simple. He wasn't interested in people. The snakes were enough. The only person who came around regularly was Dennis Felder, a 42-year-old construction worker from nearby Calhoun. Dennis was the kind of guy everyone liked. Steady, good-natured, always ready to lend a hand without making a show of it. He was married with 2 kids, coached Little League in the summer, and still texted old high school friends just to check in. The snakes made him nervous, but he tolerated Carl's odd world mostly out of curiosity, and maybe a bit of sympathy. They'd met at a bar the year before and had fallen into a casual rhythm. Weekend beers, sports on the TV, and long conversations that drifted from life to work to whatever Carl was feeding that week. Carl needed the company. Dennis didn't mind giving it. The visits always followed the same pattern. Carl would eventually start talking about one of the snakes, usually Sadie, his favorite, and press Dennis to hold her. Dennis always laughed it off, but Carl didn't let it go. Over time, the suggestion turned into a challenge. Dennis wasn't reckless, but he hated looking like he was scared of something. Carl knew that, and he leaned into it. Sadie lived in a custom-built enclosure in the corner of the living room. At over 100 pounds, she was Carl's favorite. Burmese pythons aren't venomous, but they are powerful constrictors capable of crushing the life out of prey in seconds. Sadie had a history of reactive behavior. She had once struck at Carl's arm during a tank cleaning and had crushed a broom handle in an escape attempt. But Carl treated those incidents like quirks. He often described her as well-behaved, if a little feisty. That Saturday afternoon, Dennis showed up like usual. The house was hot, the snakes had been fed the day before, and Carl was in a good mood. After some small talk and a couple of beers, he made the suggestion again, one Dennis had heard many times before. But this time, for reasons no one would ever be able to fully explain, Dennis gave in. Carl retrieved Sadie from her enclosure and carefully looped the thick body across Dennis's shoulders, adjusting the tail to keep it balanced. Dennis stood still while Carl stepped back to take a photo, framing the shot in the dim living room light. The python began to shift before the camera clicked. The tightening started almost playfully, barely noticeable at first. Then her body rippled again, tighter this time, pulling inwards across Dennis's chest and upper arms. Carl hesitated, watching for a moment too long, unsure whether Dennis was reacting or overreacting. But Sadie was already tightening further. Her coils crossed over Dennis's upper chest and neck, the full weight of her body anchoring him in place. He tried to lift his arms but couldn't. His legs buckled. By the time Carl dropped the phone and rushed forward, the python's body had locked in completely. Carl grabbed at Sadie's midsection, trying to loosen her hold, but her body was a single muscular loop. She adjusted her grip again, coiling higher, crushing his throat and compressing his ribs with every pulse. Dennis collapsed onto the carpet, flailing once before going still. His eyes rolled back, his lips turned blue. Carl continued to pull at the snake until his own arms began to tremble from the effort. Sadie didn't release him until minutes later, her body slowly unwinding as the struggle faded. Carl froze for several seconds before grabbing his phone with his shaking hands and dialing 911. His voice cracked on the call. He didn't say the word dead, just that his friend wasn't breathing and that a snake had attacked him. The dispatcher told him to remove the animal if possible. He tried, but Sadie was still partially coiled around Dennis's torso, her body loose but unmoving, her tongue flicking lazily at the air. Carl backed off and opened the front door, pacing in tight circles as sirens drew closer. Paramedics arrived within minutes, followed by a sheriff's deputy and animal control. The living room was cramped, humid, and silent except for the hum of the heat lamps and Carl's panicked breathing. One EMT knelt beside Dennis to check for a pulse, while another began the process of freeing what remained of Sadie's grip. She didn't resist. The team moved fast, lifting Dennis onto the floor and initiating chest compressions while an oxygen mask was fitted and IV lines were prepped. They worked through every protocol, but there was no rhythm, no breath. Dennis was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner's report later confirmed asphyxiation as the primary cause of death, with additional trauma to the trachea and upper cervical vertebrae. His carotid arteries had been compressed within seconds. The damage was survivable only if the pressure had been released almost immediately. But by the time Carl realized what was happening, it was already too late. Public response was swift. Animal control seized over 30 snakes from Carl's home the next morning, including several venomous species he wasn't legally allowed to keep. The enclosures were unstable and poorly labeled, some built from old aquariums or furniture. Sadie was transported to a wildlife facility but euthanized days later due to her size and aggression history. Investigators uncovered an old forum post where Carl had described her as unpredictable, a detail later included in the case file. Though Carl wasn't criminally charged, he was permanently banned from owning exotic animals. The story faded from headlines, but the truth remained. Dennis had never wanted to hold that snake. He only agreed because someone he trusted wouldn't stop asking. Dennis Felder died in a stranger's house wrapped in the coils of an animal he never wanted to touch. But for Yulia Morozova in Russia, the danger came from something far more familiar. A chimpanzee she had raised from infancy in a home she thought was safe. April 16, 2000 began like any other cool spring day in Voronezh. The last patches of snow had melted and the gray clouds drifted over rows of dacha roofs and fenced-in garden plots. The streets were quiet that afternoon in the Morozov's neighborhood, an older residential stretch just outside the city center. Beyond a faded iron gate, the couple's modest brick home sat tucked behind a line of bare trees. Laundry hung on a line in the yard. A bicycle leaned against the fence. Nothing about the scene suggested what was about to happen inside. Yulia Morozova was 34, a former schoolteacher who had stepped away from the classroom a few years earlier after her mother fell ill. Quiet and soft-spoken, she had a gentle confidence about her that made her popular with students, especially the younger ones. She loved watercolor painting, kept her garden meticulous, and had a habit of rescuing injured animals from the side of the road, nursing birds and kittens back to health in the spare room. Friends described her as deeply empathetic, the kind of person who remembered birthdays and never forgot to send thank you cards. Children gravitated to her, so did animals. Her husband Pavel, 35, worked in construction and had recently started a small roofing business with a childhood friend. They didn't have children, though neighbors recalled they once planned to adopt. Instead, their home was filled with little personal comforts. Stacked books in the hallway, homemade jam in the cupboard, and music always playing low in the background. It wasn't a flashy life, but it was a close one. And for the past 12 years, they had shared it with a chimpanzee. Stefan had arrived as a baby, gifted to Pavel by a business contact from Moscow who dabbled in exotic animal trade. At first, he was a novelty. They bottle-fed him, dressed him in hand-sewn clothes, and posed him for family photos. Neighbors would stop by just to see him wave. He learned basic routines quickly, how to sit at the table, open cabinet doors, bring in the newspaper. In photos from those early years, he sat between them on the couch like a child. Yulia especially doted on him. She treated Stefan like an extension of the family, brushing his fur after meals, stroking his head when he grew agitated. Even as he grew stronger, she believed she understood him, that her calmness kept him calm too. But chimpanzees are not built for domestic life. In the wild, adult males can weigh over 130 pounds and possess 5 to 6 times the upper body strength of an average human. Their arms are designed for climbing and overpowering prey, and their canine teeth, especially in mature males, can inflict catastrophic injuries. Stefan's strength began to reveal itself early. By the time he turned 7, he could lift furniture without effort, bend low-gauge metal with his hands, and could not be physically restrained without equipment designed for zoo environments. The Morozovs adapted by building a reinforced metal enclosure in the back sunroom, complete with climbing bars, a hammock, and a rotation of enrichment toys. He was kept indoors most of the time, with limited, closely supervised sessions in the fenced backyard. But it wasn't just his strength that changed. It was his temperament. Stefan began showing flashes of agitation, sudden barking vocalizations, prolonged sulking, episodes of destruction when left alone. He grew more possessive of objects, more reactive to small changes in routine. Some days he would press his face to the enclosure bars and watch silently for hours. Yulia dismissed the behavior as boredom or frustration. She believed her calm presence could settle him. But primatologists would have seen it differently. Textbook signs of a male chimpanzee entering a volatile stage of maturity where social dominance, resource guarding, and unpredictable aggression often emerge. Neighbors grew uncomfortable and stopped coming by. Warnings were quietly voiced, but inside the Morozov home, the belief remained. Stefan was family, and they weren't going to give up on him. On that Sunday afternoon, Yulia was cleaning Stefan's enclosure while Pavel worked in the garage. It was something she did often, spraying down surfaces, replacing enrichment items, checking the locks. According to the timeline reconstructed later, she was nearly done when Stefan began vocalizing loudly. Short bursts of barking sounds that had, in the past, meant frustration. It isn't clear whether she missed the signs or simply misjudged them. She opened the enclosure door to retrieve a plastic toy he had flung across the room. That was when he lunged. The sounds of the attack were heard by 2 neighbors. They described a sequence of high-pitched shrieks and heavy thuds, followed by a man's voice shouting in panic. Pavel had run inside after hearing the commotion and found Stefan straddling Yulia's body. Blood streaked the walls and floor. Her hair had been torn out in clumps, and Stefan was beating her head against the tile with terrifying force. Pavel shouted and threw a broom handle, which snapped against Stefan's shoulder without effect. He backed out of the house and ran across the yard, fumbling for his phone as he screamed for help. The dispatcher reported his voice as incoherent, his breath ragged, the word chimpanzee repeated over and over. Police arrived within 12 minutes, followed closely by local veterinary officials. The front door had been left open. One officer entered first and immediately retreated. radioing for backup and warning that the animal was still loose. It took a team with tranquilizers and riot shields to corner Stefan near the sunroom and sedate him through the bars. But the damage had already been done. Yulia's body was found crumpled on the blood-slick floor, her limbs twisted unnaturally, her face unrecognizable. She had sustained massive cranial trauma, multiple fractures, and deep lacerations to the neck and torso. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma and exsanguination. The injuries to her skull and upper spine were so severe that survival was unlikely even with immediate medical aid. Forensic examiners later estimated the attack lasted less than 3 minutes. Stefan, once sedated, was transported under heavy restraint to a secure veterinary compound and euthanized later that night. The incident ignited national outrage. Russia's exotic pet laws at the time were vague, relying heavily on regional enforcement and loopholes. Investigators confirmed that the Morozovs had no permits for Stefan, but with no prior complaints filed and no evidence of trafficking intent, Pavel was not charged with a crime. Animal rights groups pointed to the case as proof of the growing exotic pet crisis. Media coverage was intense for a few weeks. News segments replayed blurry home footage of Stefan at birthday parties, sitting at the kitchen table, looking eerily human. Public opinion split between shock and morbid fascination. Pavel never gave interviews. Neighbors described him as devastated, vacant-eyed, barely speaking, refusing to enter the back room of the house again. In the months that followed, he stopped answering calls and turned away friends who came to check on him. One relative reported he had packed away every photograph of Stefan and Yulia, leaving only a bare shelf where their pictures used to sit. Yulia was buried in a quiet cemetery outside the city. The headstone listed only her name and the year, no epitaph, nothing else to explain what happened behind the walls of that house, or why no one stopped it sooner. Yulia believed love and routine could tame a chimpanzee, but instinct shattered that illusion in seconds. In New Jersey, Kendra Wallace never let her guard down. Yet even caution wasn't enough when a powerful dog was always just a door away. October 12, 2018 was quiet on the 3rd floor of Oakline Towers, a brick apartment building tucked behind a convenience store and a stretch of chain-link fencing in Newark's West Ward. The air outside smelled faintly of trash and wet leaves, and inside the halls were narrow and dimly lit, with peeling paint and the occasional flicker from old motion sensors. Tenants came and went quietly, nobody lingered. And for Kendra Wallace, that silence had started to feel like a warning. She was 29, a pharmacy technician with a short commute and a routine that rarely changed. Friends described her as cautious, sharp-witted, and warm, the kind of person who left small gifts outside neighbors' doors during the holidays and always reminded the kids upstairs to lock their bikes. Kendra didn't look for trouble. She minded her business, paid rent on time, and kept to herself. But for months, she had been afraid to step outside her door, and the reason was always the same. Matthew Reyes lived 4 doors down. He was 36, worked late shifts at a freight warehouse across town, and rarely spoke to anyone in the building. He wasn't unfriendly, just detached, the kind of tenant who nodded in passing but kept his head down and his schedule off everyone else's radar. What people remembered wasn't Matthew, it was his dog. Diesel, a massive Presa Canario with cropped ears and a thick leather collar, had been with him for over 3 years. The breed, originally developed in the Canary Islands for guarding livestock, is known for its imposing size, territorial nature, and explosive strength. Adult males can top 130 pounds and exert more than 500 pounds of bite pressure, enough to break bone and crush joints. In the wrong hands, they can be lethal. Diesel had already lunged at a delivery driver and once charged a child near the stairwell before Matthew hauled him back. Several tenants had seen him snarl and throw his weight into the leash when anyone got too close. Kendra had grown used to the low growl through her door when they passed in the hall. She had filed multiple complaints, 2 emails, 1 phone call, and even flagged down a passing animal control officer in the parking lot. She described Diesel's behavior, asked for someone to investigate, begged for enforcement, but no inspection was ever scheduled, no citation issued, and nothing about Diesel's presence ever changed. The reports were taken and quietly forgotten. With each passing week, Kendra grew more cautious. By October, Kendra had developed a habit one her neighbors noticed. She'd press her ear to the door before leaving, listening for footsteps, keys, or the low rattle of a leash. If she heard anything, she waited. She knew the signs. Diesel was too strong for most to handle, and Matthew never used a muzzle. So Kendra waited, and when it seemed quiet, she stepped out. That Friday night, she was taking out a single bag of trash. Just a short walk to the chute at the end of the hall. She opened her door like always, but this time she didn't get the chance to listen first. Diesel was already there. He lunged before she could register what she was seeing. The first bite sank into her upper thigh, locking her in place as his full weight crashed into her side. She screamed and fell backward, hitting the floor hard. The trash bag burst open beside her. Diesel didn't let go. He bit again, lower this time, shaking his head violently and dragging her across the thin carpet toward the stairwell wall. Her leg tore open under the pressure. Blood smeared the floor. Doors flew open. Someone shouted. A neighbor ran toward the scene with a broomstick, swinging wildly at Diesel's back. Another tenant threw a laundry basket, but nothing broke his focus. Diesel was locked in, his jaws clamped, paws braced, the hallway echoing with snarls and screams. The attack lasted nearly 2 minutes. It ended when Matthew dropped to the ground and twisted Diesel's tail hard while yanking his back legs out from under him. A brutal but effective maneuver used by handlers to break a dog's grip. Diesel let go with a snarl, stumbling sideways as Matthew dragged him away by the collar, still thrashing and trying to turn back. Diesel fought against him even as Kendra lay bleeding on the floor, eyes wide, lips moving without sound. A neighbor pressed towels to the wound and screamed for someone to call 911. Blood soaked through within seconds. Paramedics arrived fast, but her femoral artery had been severed. She lost consciousness before they reached the ambulance and was pronounced dead en route to the hospital. The autopsy confirmed what witnesses had already described. Kendra had bled out from catastrophic vascular damage to her upper leg and hip. The bite force had ruptured her femoral artery, and the speed of blood loss left no chance for recovery. The injuries were consistent with a high-pressure attack from a large Mastiff-type breed. Swift, brutal, and impossible to survive without immediate surgical intervention. The aftermath moved swiftly. Investigators confirmed that animal control had received multiple complaints about Diesel but failed to act. Police records showed no formal warnings had ever been issued to Matthew Reyes. Under pressure from city officials, a review was launched into enforcement failures. Matthew was cited for negligence and housing violations, but no criminal charges were filed. Diesel was seized and euthanized by court order. Kendra's family filed a civil lawsuit citing ongoing negligence and failure to enforce building safety policies. Matthew left the building within days. His unit stayed vacant for nearly a year. Kendra's funeral was held in East Orange. Neighbors filled the pews, many who'd barely known her, but all who had seen her kindness in passing. Her mother spoke quietly, saying no one should have to live in fear of stepping into their own hallway. Kendra followed every rule she could and still ended in blood on the hallway floor. In South Africa, Daniel Thatcher made the rules himself, and when they failed, a teenage guest paid the price. March 19, 2017 was warm and dry in the fertile valley of Franschhoek, where vineyards spread across the hills like green patchwork and the late afternoon air smelled faintly of smoke and jasmine. The dirt roads behind the wine estates led to quieter properties, places tucked behind electronic gates where foreigners came to retire in luxury. One of those belonged to Daniel Thatcher, a 50-year-old former software engineer from Texas. His home sat on 40 acres of converted farmland with a main house, 2 guest cottages, and a high-walled enclosure at the back. He called it a reserve, though it wasn't open to the public. Locals simply called it the place with the tiger. Daniel had arrived in South Africa in 2012, shortly after selling his company for a figure large enough that he never had to work again. He and his wife had dreamed of a slower life, land, animals, quiet mornings. But for Daniel, animals meant more than horses and chickens. Within a year, he'd begun acquiring exotic species. 2 zebras, a capuchin monkey, an aging cheetah from a failed rehabilitation center, and eventually a Bengal tiger named Raka. He built enclosures with the help of a local contractor, hired a rotating staff of handlers, and poured money into fencing, feeding, and veterinary care. It was self-funded, unlicensed, and unregulated, but pristine. Daniel wasn't careless, he had rules, and for years those rules had kept everyone safe. His neighbors respected him, many admired what he had built, and a few, like the Maboya family from a nearby village, became regular guests. Sipho and Lindui Maboya would often visit with their 2 children, Brian and Ella. They'd sit on the garden terrace sipping coffee while the kids toured the grounds with Daniel's staff, snapping pictures beside the animals and asking the kind of questions only teenagers can. How fast can it run? Does it like people? Can I take a photo with it? Tigers, particularly Bengal tigers like Raka, are ambush predators built for explosive power and precision. A full-grown male can weigh more than 500 pounds, leap over 20 feet, and deliver a bone-breaking bite with jaws capable of exerting over 1,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. In the wild, they're solitary hunters, striking without warning and aiming for the neck or throat. In captivity, their instincts remain intact, even if their world is smaller. On that particular Sunday, things were no different. The Maboyas arrived mid-morning. Daniel greeted them at the gate with his usual warmth, led them to the terrace, and sent one of his assistants, a young man named Jerome, to walk the kids around. The cheetah was sleeping, the monkey was in its hammock. The tiger Raka lay stretched in the sun at the far end of his yard, his amber eyes half-lidded. He looked peaceful. Raka was Daniel's pride. He had come to the reserve 5 years earlier from a failed breeding operation in Gauteng. At full size, he weighed nearly 500 pounds and stretched over 10 feet from nose to tail. His paws were massive, his canines yellowed but intact, and his behavior was generally calm, but staff had noted changes in recent months. He'd begun pacing more, he'd responded to commands more slowly. A week earlier, he had growled during a feeding. Still, he hadn't shown open aggression, so the photo routine continued. Jerome led Brian to the edge of the inner fence, a reinforced barrier between the walking path and the tiger yard. They had done it all before. Brian would crouch down, flash a peace sign, and Jerome would frame the shot so the tiger appeared closer than he really was. But this time, something changed. As Brian crouched, Raka rose. It was subtle at first, a flick of the tail, a shift in weight. But as Brian adjusted his stance, turning slightly to the left, Raka moved fast. In a blur, he surged toward the fence, leapt onto the lower ledge at the corner, and slammed his weight against the gate separating the inner and outer enclosure. The latch gave. The sound was like metal snapping under tension. Jerome shouted and stepped forward, but it was too late. Raka lunged, hitting Brian with the full weight of his body and knocking him backward onto the gravel. His teeth found the boy's shoulder first, then the neck. Blood arced across the walkway. Brian screamed once before it turned into choking gasps. Jerome grabbed a metal pole from the ground and struck the tiger's flank, but it barely registered. Raka twisted, dragging the boy several feet along the path, jaws still locked. Back at the house, Sipho and Lindue heard the commotion. They ran as Jerome continued striking, yelling, doing anything to break the animal's grip. 2 other staff members arrived seconds later with fire extinguishers, standard protocol for emergencies. The sudden blast of foam and sound startled Rocca enough that he loosened his hold. Jerome pulled Brian's body away while the others formed a line between them and the tiger, who now paced near the far wall, growling low. An emergency call was made from the house. Paramedics arrived within 15 minutes, but Brian had already lost too much blood. His carotid artery had been severed and his trachea was partially collapsed. CPR was attempted on site, but he was pronounced dead before the ambulance could leave the property. The postmortem confirmed what responders already knew. Brian had died from massive blood loss after sustaining deep puncture wounds to his neck and shoulder. The injuries were fatal within minutes. The enclosure gate investigators found had been reinforced only once in 5 years, using a modified garden latch not built to withstand the force of a full-grown tiger. Authorities shut the facility down within a week. The animals were removed and Rocca, after exhibiting further aggression during transfer, was euthanized by order of the Provincial Wildlife Board. Daniel was not charged, but a civil case moved forward citing negligence and failure to follow enclosure safety recommendations from years prior. Brian's funeral was held in the village cemetery, with classmates standing quietly in uniform along the edge of the grave. Ella stayed home from school for nearly a month. Daniel left South Africa the following year. The land was sold, the fences came down, and whatever goodwill he had built faded behind the silence he left behind. Thanks for watching this video. If you love this video, you'll for sure also love the one on your end screen right now. Hope to see you there.